Welcome back to The Deep Dive. We're the show where we take these, well, sometimes pretty mind-bending ideas and really try to unpack them, figure out what's important and, why it actually matters to us.
Absolutely.
Have you ever had that feeling, that kind of strange, nagging disconnect, where the world that, say, science describes, atoms, forces, math, all sort of colorless, valueless, purely mechanical?
The machine view.
Yeah, exactly. It feels so profoundly different from the world we actually experience, right? The one that's just bursting with color and beauty, like a sunset, or that feeling of love or purpose, and just consciousness itself. Our awareness of it all, it's like there's this invisible wall between the sort of cold, hard facts we're told are real and the rich, meaningful reality we feel, deep down every day. It's a feeling a lot of us get, I think, even if we don't quite have a name for it.
Well, that feeling you're describing, it's not just some vague discomfort. It's actually a really profound philosophical problem. Some major thinkers have wrestled with this for, well, centuries.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and Alfred Whitehead, who's one of the thinkers we're really going to dive into today, a brilliant philosopher and mathematician, he actually gave this problem a name. He called it the bifurcation of nature.
Bifurcation of nature. Okay, that sounds pretty significant. What does it actually mean to say nature's been, well, split in two?
It points to what he saw as the crisis in modern thought. See, on one side, you have the world of scientific description. The universe is physics, chemistry presented. It's all mass, particles, brute facts. Science is amazing at explaining how things work, cause and effect.
Right, the mechanics.
The mechanics, exactly. But it often seems to leave out everything that gives life meaning. Where does beauty fit in that picture? Or love? Or consciousness? Purpose? Where are they in a universe of just forces and fields?
And that's where that feeling really hits home, isn't it? Because the other side is our world of human experience, our actual lived reality. And that reality is just soaked in these things, meaning, value, vivid feelings. How do you even start to bridge that gap, make sense of a world that feels so vibrant to us when the scientific way of looking at it seems to strip all that away?
Precisely. And this split, this chasm, it leaves no coherent place for concepts that have always been central to how humans understand the world. Things like, well, the mind itself, what meaning is, or even how we might conceive of God.
Oh.
Because if that scientific description, that objective, value-free world is the only reality, then where do all these deep, subjective, really important parts of our lives fit? It just creates this crisis of coherence for almost everything we value.
And that's exactly the intellectual adventure we're setting out on today. We're going to explore the work of two really brilliant minds, Alfred Whitehead, who we mentioned, and Wolfgang Smith. Both of them saw this fundamental problem, this bifurcation, as a core crisis for modern times. But here's where it gets really interesting. They came up with radically different solutions. I mean, completely different ways to try and mend that split.
Yeah, night and day, really.
And crucially, for our deep dive today, their solutions have these huge, profound implications for how they understand God, God's existence, God's nature, everything.
You can almost picture it like this. Whitehead, his path is trying to integrate all the big findings of modern science, relativity, quantum physics, stuff that showed the universe is way weirder and more dynamic than Newton thought.
Right, integrate them into philosophy.
Integrate them into a grand, unified, what he called an organic vision of reality.
Right.
He didn't just tweet things. He built a whole new system, process philosophy, basically from scratch to do it. And in his system, God isn't some exception to the rules of the universe. God is actually a necessary dynamic part within this cosmic process, subject to its ultimate principles.
Okay, so Whitehead's building a completely new ship, a modern ship, designed to navigate these new scientific waters. But Wolfgang Smith, he takes a totally different approach, almost the reverse, doesn't he?
He really does. Smith essentially says, hang on, we took a major wrong turn way back. He argues we need to reject the basic philosophical assumptions that modern science itself rests on.
Reject the foundations. Wow.
Yeah, he argues that our whole modern worldview, shaped by people like Descartes, Newton, is inherently flawed. So his work is about reviving and re-explaining what's called the Perennial Philosophy. He draws on these incredibly old, deep traditions, Platonism, the hardcore logic of scholasticism, think Thomas Aquinas.
Aquinas, right, big name.
Huge. And even insights from Eastern thought, like Advaita Vedanta. For Smith, God isn't in the system. God stands completely above the created order. God is the transcendent, unchanging, timeless source of it all.
So one guy builds a new system to embrace science. The other says the scientific foundation itself is flawed, and we need to go back to ancient wisdom. That's a fundamental disagreement.
It's a profound divergence. One tries to incorporate modern discoveries into a new framework. The other says the very framework that produced those discoveries is the problem, and we need an older, wiser, more holistic view.
Okay, so our mission today is to really dive deep into both of these conceptions of God. We want to understand the core ideas, get a feel for how they work from the inside out. Then we'll put them side by side, really highlight the sharp differences, and hopefully give you a solid grasp of these two, well, monumental ways of thinking.
Right. By the end, you should have a much clearer picture of these two fascinating but ultimately, yeah, irreconcilable visions of reality and the divine.
Okay, let's start with Alfred North Whitehead. We said he was deeply concerned about this gap between science and lived experience. So how did he propose to bring them back together? What kind of universe did he imagine that could heal that split?
Well, Whitehead proposed a universe that's fundamentally about becoming. It's about dynamic process, not static being. So imagine reality isn't like a collection of fixed things like bricks in a wall.
Okay, not static objects.
No. Think of it more like a river, always flowing, always changing, always forming and transforming. This was a pretty radical shift from a lot of traditional Western philosophy, which tended to focus on what things are, their substance. Whitehead said, no, the most fundamental reality isn't what is, but what's happening, the process itself.
So if everything's constantly flowing, constantly in process, what are the actual, building blocks? How does this process work at the very smallest level? What's it made of?
Right. For Whitehead, the universe is made up of momentary actual occasions of experience. Now, try not to think of these as tiny, solid bits, like little particles. That's the old way.
Okay, not many marbles.
Not many marbles now. They're more like fleeting flashes of experience, tiny pulses of coming into being, each lasting for just an incredibly brief moment. Think of them as the fundamental bits of reality, but the bits are events. They're experiences, not static things.
Whoa, okay, so tiny, super fast moments of experience, like little sparks.
Kind of like that, yeah. Each actual occasion pops into existence, it lives out as momentary life, and in that moment it experiences and takes in what came just before it. And then, and this is crucial, it perishes. It ceases to be that specific occasion.
It just vanishes.
Not exactly into nothing. This is the profound part. As it perishes, it becomes data, or what Whitehead called prehensions, for new actual occasions that are just coming into being right after it. So it's grasped, it's felt, it's taken into the being of the next moment.
Ah, I see. So it's like a continuous chain reaction of these experiential moments, each one building on the last one.
Yeah, it's a constant flowing stream creating the very fabric of reality. Not static stuff, but a dynamic unfolding of experience influencing the next experience.
That's a very different picture of the universe. So where does God fit into this dynamic, process-driven reality? Is God somehow exempt from these rules, standing outside the flow? Or is God part of this cosmic dance, too?
And that is one of Whitehead's most radical and, I think, brilliant insights. God, in his system, is not an exception to these rules. In fact, Whitehead says God is the chief exemplification of these very principles of process and becoming.
The chief example. So God also follows these rules.
Yes. It means God, too, has to be understood as a process, deeply related to the world, and, yes, in some way, temporal, involved in time. To make sense of God in this dynamic universe, Whitehead proposed that God has a dipolar nature, two poles. This idea is really central to his whole solution. It's how he tries to resolve that old paradox. How can a perfect eternal being interact with a changing, often suffering world?
Okay, the dipolar nature. This is where it gets really fascinating, maybe a bit mind-bending for us. God has two complementary sides or aspects, one that's unchanging and one that changes, one transcendent, one involved.
Exactly. Let's unpack the first one, the primordial nature. This is sometimes called the mind of God. This pole is God's eternal, unchanging, abstract aspect. Unconscious, but not like unawareness in humans. It means it doesn't experience concrete events like we do, or like God's other pole does.
Okay, so what is it then?
Its essence is like an infinite reservoir of all pure possibilities. Whitehead called these eternal objects.
Eternal objects. That sounds a bit like Plato's forms, doesn't it? Like the perfect, timeless ideas of things. Blueprints.
You're definitely on the right track. It's similar to Platonic forms, but with a key Whiteheadian twist. They are pure potentials. They are the what might be. The ideal forms of, say, beauty or truth or justice, or even specific things like the pure potential for the color red, or a specific geometric shape or a particular emotion.
So all possibilities.
All possibilities. Think of all the melodies a composer could ever write, all the stories a novelist could ever tell, all the designs an architect could dream up. They exist eternally as pure potential, just waiting, needing to be actualized, made real in the world. It's the ultimate source of order, the form of forms.
Okay, so this infinite realm of potential, what does it do? How does this blueprint interact with the actual messy, dynamic universe we live in?
The primordial nature functions as the principle of order. It's what stops reality from just being random chaos. For every single actual occasion, remember those fleeting moments of experience. As that comes into being, the primordial nature provides what Whitehead calls an initial aim, or a lure.
A lure, like bait.
Sort of. Like a gentle suggestion, maybe a divine whisper, or an irresistible pull. It guides each new moment of experience toward novelty, toward greater beauty, complexity, intensity of feeling. It's God's perfect conceptual vision of everything that could be, kind of graded by relevance for that specific moment, always offering the best possible way forward. But, and this is key, this pole is deficient in actuality. It's just a vision, an ideal, a potential. It's not yet concrete reality.
I like the analogy we talked about before. It's like the unplayed score of an infinite symphony, right?
Yeah.
It has every possible beautiful melody, every harmony, all the potential for amazing music. But no actual sound has been made yet. Just the blueprint, the ideal, the divine potential.
That's a great way to put it. It's the transcendent vision, the source of all potential order and beauty, constantly luring the world onward and upward. Without it, there'd be no direction, no striving.
Okay, that's pole number one, the eternal mind of God, the ideal potential. What about the second pole, the consequent nature? This sounds like where God gets, well, much more involved in the actual world.
That's exactly right. The consequent nature is the experience of God, and it's the complete opposite of the primordial nature in many ways. This pole is temporal, it exists in time, it's ever-growing, fully conscious, and deeply concrete. It is God's active, living experience of the world as it actually happens, moment by moment.
God's experience of the world. How does that work?
As each actual occasion, those tiny flashes of experience lives out its momentary existence and then perishes. Remember how it becomes data for the next occasion? Well, it also gets objectively immortalized in the consequent nature of God.
Objectively immortalized. Okay, that sounds a bit mystical. Can you break that down for us? What does it really mean?
It means that God prehends, which for Whitehead means God feels, grasps, takes right into his own being, and perfectly remembers every single event. Every joy, every pain, every tiny flicker of experience, every detail from the entire cosmos. Nothing that actually happens, no act of kindness, no moment of suffering, no burst of creativity is ever truly lost or forgotten.
Wow, nothing lost.
Nothing is truly lost. Every sensation, every thought, every interaction gets woven into the everlasting, ever-expanding tapestry of God's own life. And this profoundly makes God the fellow sufferer who understands.
It's a fellow sufferer.
Yes, God isn't some distant, detached monarch watching from above. God is an intimate participant in the whole cosmic drama, sharing in its tragedies and its triumphs. And crucially, because the world is always unfolding, always creating new experiences, this consequent nature of God grows and changes as the world grows and changes. God's experience expands because reality itself is always expanding.
That's a profoundly different image of God for a lot of people, I think. A God who isn't just watching, but is feeling everything right along with us, taking every moment into his own being. So if the primordial nature was the unplayed score, the consequent nature is like the symphony actually being performed, and God is both the conductor and the ultimate listener who doesn't miss a single note.
Precisely. Think of that symphony playing out right now, always expanding, always becoming richer. And the divine conductor doesn't just direct it through those initial lures, those primordial possibilities, but perfectly hears, remembers, and cherishes every single note, every sound, every clash, every harmony, every moment of the actual performance. All of it is held within God's being forever, given eternal value.
So you have these two poles, the eternal potential and the ever-growing experience. How does Whitehead then describe God's overall relationship to the world? Is God the world? Is the world in God?
Okay, this is a really important distinction. Whitehead's view is called panentheism, which sounds like pantheism, but it's different.
Right, pantheism is a God is the world, everything is God.
Exactly. Panentheism says the world is in God, but God is more than the world. So the consequent nature, God's experience, is constituted by the world's experiences, yes, but the primordial nature, that infinite realm of possibilities, transcends the actual world. So God contains the world, but God isn't limited to or exhausted by the world. God is the unifying experience of all things and also the transcendent potential for all things.
Okay, so the world is in God, but God is bigger than the world. Got it. And if God isn't performing miracles in the old-fashioned sense, how does this process God actually act in the world? What kind of power are we talking about?
God's power here is one of persuasion, not coercion. That's a key phrase for Whitehead. God doesn't intervene by breaking the laws of nature, doesn't force things to happen. Instead, God offers that best possible path forward for each actual occasion, for every event, through those initial aims, those lures from the primordial nature.
Offers the path.
Offers it, yes. But, and this is crucial for freedom, each event, each actual occasion keeps its own measure of freedom, its own power of self-creation. It can accept that divine aim, it can reject it, or it can modify it. So God is often described beautifully as the poet of the world, leading it with tender patience through his vision of truth, beauty, and goodness. God doesn't force. God inspires, invites, lures.
Which leads us straight to one of the biggest theological questions there is. The problem of evil. If God is good, why is there so much suffering? How does Whitehead's process God deal with this huge, deeply human question?
This is a really key point. It's where Whitehead's view offers a kind of unique comfort, I think, for many people. Because the world has its own freedom, its own power of self-creation, and because God works through persuasion, not force, God is not omnipotent in the classical way. God isn't all-powerful in a way that means he can just unilaterally prevent all evil or suffering.
He can't just snap his fingers and stop it.
No, because doing that would violate the world's freedom, the very nature of process itself. So God's response to evil isn't to magically erase it. It's something more, empathetic and transformative. God's response is to absorb the suffering into his own being, that's the consequent nature feeling it all, and then transform it by luring the world toward a better future. God redeems the world not by brute force, but by love, by understanding, by constant companionship. The pain isn't just wiped away, but it's held, it's felt, it's valued, and it's used as fuel, as data for new possibilities of good. What stands out to you about a God who feels and experiences all the pain of the world right alongside us? For many people, especially when they're facing terrible suffering, that might feel more relatable, more comforting maybe, than a distant, all-powerful God who just allows it. It's definitely a vision of the divine that emphasizes deep empathy and participation. It suggests that even in the darkest times, you're not alone, that suffering is known, felt, and carried by God himself.
Okay, now let's pivot. And it's a sharp pivot, really. If Whitehead set out to build this whole new philosophical ship, incorporating modern science to fix that bifurcation, Wolfgang Smith takes a completely different tack, almost the opposite. He basically says the old ship was fine, better even, and we're the ones who need to get back on board.
That's a great way to put it. Wolfgang Smith, who's fascinating because he's an accomplished physicist and mathematician as well as a philosopher, argues that modernity's biggest mistake was throwing out what he calls the traditional hierarchical cosmology.
Traditional hierarchical cosmology.
He believes that somewhere along the line, maybe starting around Descartes, Newton, we lost touch with a much deeper, more complete understanding of reality. So his work, especially in books like The Quantum Enigma or Cosmos and Transcendence, is all about trying to restore this ancient traditional view. And for Smith, God isn't a part within the system, like in Whitehead. God is the utterly transcendent ground of the system itself.
And he draws on older traditions.
Very much so. He draws heavily on the Perennial Philosophy, this idea that there are universal truths found across many ancient spiritual and philosophical paths. And he particularly leans on scholastic metaphysics, the super rigorous philosophy of thinkers like St. Thomas Aquinas from the Middle Ages.
So Smith is essentially saying our modern scientific view, yeah, it's powerful for what it does, but it's fundamentally broken at its philosophical roots. And to really get reality, we need to go back to an older, maybe forgotten way of seeing.
Pretty much, yes.
Yeah.
And central to that older way is this idea of a hierarchy of being. This is absolutely core to understanding Smith.
Hierarchy of being, what does he mean by that? How does reality stack up for him?
Okay, this is a really crucial concept. He argues reality is not like a flat, single-level playing field of just physical stuff, which is kind of how modern science often implicitly treats it. Instead, reality is a hierarchy of ontological levels, distinct levels of being, of existence. Each level is more fundamental, more subtle, maybe more encompassing than the one below it.
Like floors in a building.
Exactly like floors in a building, where each floor has its own nature, but it's ultimately held up, sustained by the floors above it. He usually talks about three main domains or levels.
Okay, what are they?
First, at the bottom, you have the corporeal domain. This is the physical world we usually think of: objects, things in space and time, stuff we see, touch, measure, atoms, planets, bodies. This is the realm modern science mostly studies. It's real, but it's the lowest, most derivative level.
Okay, the physical world, level 1.
Then above that, there's the psychic domain. This is an intermediate realm. It's the realm of the soul, of images, emotions, thoughts, what he sometimes calls subtle forms. Think about your dreams, your imagination, your feelings. They're real experiences, right? But they aren't physical like a rock is. They exist on a different, more internal, non-physical plane.
Right. Thoughts, feelings, images.
Yeah.
Got it. Level 2.
And then at the highest level, you have the noetic or spiritual domain. This is a realm of pure intellect, pure forms, archetypes, universal truths. And ultimately, this is the realm where God resides, or more accurately, is the source of. It's a realm beyond space, time, even beyond the individual soul. It's the ultimate source of all order, meaning, and reality itself.
Okay, so a layered reality. Physical, psychic, spiritual. It does sound like a ladder of existence. How do these layers connect? Is there like a flow between them? Or are they just separate floors?
Oh, there's a profound connection, but it's not the kind of connection we usually think about.
Yeah.
This brings us to another absolutely critical idea for Smith: vertical causality.
Vertical causality. Okay, how is that different from regular causality?
Regular causality, the kind science studies, is horizontal causality. Thanks to one billiard ball hits another, makes it move. A causes B, causes C, all happening within the same level of reality, unfolding sequentially in time.
Right. A leads to B leads to C along the timeline. That's how we normally think of cause and effect. Makes sense.
Exactly. Vertical causality is totally different. It's the moment-by-moment sustaining of a lower level of being by a higher one. It's not a sequence in time. It's a continuous outpouring of existence right now, from a higher, more fundamental level down to a lower dependent level. It's about ontological dependence, a constant act of creation.
Okay. Moment by moment sustaining. That's still a bit abstract. Can you give us another way to think about that? Maybe another analogy?
Sure. Think about an author and the characters in their novel. The author is the vertical cause of those characters. The characters don't exist on their own. Their entire being is continuously coming from the author's creative act, from the author's mind. They exist on a totally different level of reality than the author. You can't meet Sherlock Holmes on the street, but you could, in theory, meet Arthur Conan Doyle.
Right. The character depends entirely on the author.
Entirely and continuously. If the author stops thinking about them, stops writing, in a sense, they cease to be, the author's mind, the higher level, is constantly sustaining the character's existence within the story, the lower level. Or another classic one. Think about sunlight and a shadow. The sunlight is the vertical cause of the shadow. The shadow has no independent reality. Its existence is totally dependent on the light being there. If the sun goes behind a cloud, if the light is withdrawn, the shadow instantly vanishes. It's not that the light created the shadow earlier and then left. It's continuously causing the shadow to exist right now.
Ah, okay. That helps. The lower level instantly ceases if the higher level withdraws its influence. So the entire universe then, at every moment, is being sustained by a higher reality through this vertical causality.
That's exactly the idea for Smith.
So how does this hierarchical view define God? What is God's nature, his ontology in this traditionalist picture?
Following Aquinas very closely here, Smith defines God as esse ipsum subsistens. That's Latin for subsistent being itself.
Being itself.
Being itself. This is huge. See, created things, you, me, a star, a tree, we participate in being. We have existence. It's like a quality we possess. But God doesn't just have being. God is being. God isn't a being, even the greatest being. God is the sheer, uncaused, infinite act of existing itself. The absolute source from which everything else receives its borrowed, participated existence.
Wow. Okay, so God is existence, not just has existence. And this leads to another key term you mentioned, actus purus.
Precisely. Actus purus means pure actuality. Think about change again. Anything that changes has to move from a state of potentiality, what it could be but isn't yet, to actuality, what it is now. An acorn has the potential to be an oak tree. When it grows, it actualizes that potential.
This makes sense.
But God, being pure actuality, has zero potentiality. There's nothing God could become that God isn't already, infinitely and perfectly. Therefore, God must be absolutely simple, perfect, and immutable, unchanging.
Why immutable? Because there's no potential to actualize.
Exactly. Any change would mean moving from potential to actual. But God is fully actual. There's no potential left to fulfill. So God cannot change in any way. God is utterly complete, perfect, fully actualized. Cannot improve, cannot diminish. Just is. Perfectly.
A completely unchanging, perfectly actualized being. And this immutability, this perfection, is directly tied to the idea of God's transcendence for Smith, right? God being totally separate.
Yes, God is radically transcendent. God is not in the world in that Whiteheadian sense, feeling its processes, growing with it, no. God is the ontological source from which the entire hierarchy, corporeal, psychic, noetic, gets its existence moment by moment through vertical causality. For Smith, putting God inside the temporal process, suggesting God changes or suffers like Whitehead does, that's a catastrophic metaphysical error. It's confusing the creator with the creation. It blurs the infinite difference between the absolute source and everything that merely receives being from that source.
God is the cause, not part of the effect.
Exactly, the ultimate transcendent cause.
And because God is being itself, Smith also calls God supra-ontological. What does that mean? It sounds like God is even beyond the idea of being. That's hard to grasp.
It basically means that the very word ontology, the study of being, doesn't quite apply to God in the same way it applies to everything else. Because God is the ground of all being, God sort of transcends the categories we use to define created things. God isn't just another kind of being. God is the source. So in a way, God is beyond or above the very framework of being that defines creatures. It really emphasizes God's absolute uniqueness, his otherness, his mystery.
Okay, so how do we know this God exists according to Smith? Is it through science, studying the physical world?
No, definitely not through scientific investigation of that horizontal chain of cause and effect. You find God through metaphysical reasoning. By reflecting on the contingent nature of the world, the fact that the world didn't have to exist, that it depends on something else for its being, right now, you reason back to a non-contingent, necessary source, something that must exist and whose existence doesn't depend on anything else.
And that source is continuously acting.
Continuously. The universe exists now because God is causing it to exist now through vertical causality. It's not like God wound it up at the beginning and let it go. If God were to, hypothetically, withdraw that vertical causation, that constant outpouring of being, the whole universe would just cease. Instantly. Its existence is utterly dependent, moment by moment.
Wow. Constant dependence. Okay, so what about suffering and knowledge for Smith's God? Is this God affected by the world? Does God feel our pain, learn things like Whitehead's God?
No. Smith's God is impassible. That means God cannot be affected by or made to suffer by the world. Any suffering or change in God would imply potentiality and imperfection, something lacking which contradicts God being pure actuality. So God is completely beyond suffering. For Smith, this impassibility is a defect, it's a perfection, it shows God's absolute fullness and completeness.
Okay, so beyond suffering and knowledge.
God's knowledge isn't a process of learning, like Whitehead's consequent nature-gathering experiences. God doesn't acquire knowledge over time. God knows all things past, present, and future in a single, timeless, eternal act of self-knowledge. Because God is perfect being and perfect intellect, in knowing himself perfectly, God knows everything that proceeds from him, all in one eternal now, completely outside of time.
And the problem of evil. How does this traditional view handle that if God is perfect and impassible? It's obviously very different from the fellow sufferer idea.
It is very different. From this traditional viewpoint, evil isn't a positive thing that God creates. It's understood as a privatio boni, a privation, a lack of a good that should be there. Think of darkness. It's not a substance, it's the absence of light. Blindness isn't a thing, it's the lack of sight.
So evil is a lack, an absence of good.
Yes, a defect. A falling short of the perfection that belongs to a particular created thing. It arises because the created order is, by definition, not God. It's finite, limited, and involves creatures with freedom. God permits evil, allows it to happen for the sake of a greater good, like genuine freedom, which makes love possible. But God does not cause evil directly, and God is in no way diminished or harmed by it. It's a consequence of the nature of creation itself.
So not a God who suffers with us, but a transcendent, perfect being who allows imperfection in creation for a greater purpose while remaining utterly untouched by it in his own nature.
Yeah, those are two profoundly different divine personalities, you could almost say.
Worlds apart.
Okay, so let's try and put them side by side now. We've journeyed through these two really complex, intricate philosophical worlds. What happens when we stand them next to each other? It really feels like we're looking at two completely different universes, two utterly distinct ways of understanding reality. They seem, well, irreconcilable. They absolutely are irreconcilable They represent fundamentally different metaphysical choices, different traditions, and radically different answers to the problems of modernity. Putting them side by side really throws their differences into sharp relief. It clarifies the profound choice one might make in how they conceive of, well, everything.
Let's maybe run through some of the key points we've discussed and compare them directly, just to really hammer home the contrasts. First off, their basic idea of God's nature and relationship to the world.
Okay, Whitehead. God is panentheistic and dipolar. Remember, the world is in God, but God is more than the world. That dipolar nature lets God be both transcendent, the eternal primordial nature, and deeply immanent, involved, the temporal consequent nature experiencing the world. Smith. God is theistic and radically transcendent. God is wholly other, infinitely superior to the world. The world isn't in God in the same way. The world is entirely from God, depending on him absolutely for its existence every second.
And their fundamental ontology, what they think is ultimately real. One sees a flowing river, the other a solid, unchanging mountain peak.
That's a good image. Whitehead's ontology is being in process. Reality is dynamic becoming. God is the prime example of this, a dynamic, actual entity growing in his consequent nature along with the cosmos. Smith's view, God is being itself, esse ipsum subsistens. God is pure actuality, the unmoved mover, timeless, perfectly static. All change and process belong to creation, which flows from this static, perfect source, not the source itself.
That difference process versus static being seems like the absolute core distinction that everything else flows from. How does it affect their view of time?
Hugely. For Whitehead, God has a temporal aspect. The consequent nature evolves with the world, in time, absorbing new experiences. So God journeys through time with creation. For Smith, God is eternal and timeless, completely outside of time. The whole timeline, past, present, future, is just simultaneously present to God in one single, unchanging, eternal now. No before or after for God. God simply is.
Wow. One God experiencing time with us, the other seeing all of time at once from outside it, which naturally leads to change versus immutability.
Right. Whitehead's God has both. A changing aspect, the consequent nature, feeling the world, and an unchanging aspect, the primordial nature, the realm of potentials. Smith's God as pure actuality is absolutely immutable, cannot change, period. Any change would imply moving from potential to actual, and God has no potential. He is fully actual. God's perfection is his unchangingness.
And divine power. We talked about Whitehead's persuasion, not coercion. How does that stack up against Smith's view?
Very different. Whitehead's God uses persuasive power, luring, suggesting, inviting, respecting freedom. Not omnipotent in the classical sense of being able to just make anything happen or prevent anything. Smith's God is omnipotent in the traditional sense, exercising power through vertical causality. God's power is the absolute continuous act of creating and sustaining everything that exists. Limitless, ultimate power.
And back to suffering, which is such a critical point for many. Whitehead's God is the fellow sufferer.
Correct. Whitehead's God is passible, can be affected by, feels, absorbs the world's pain and joy into his own being, transforming it. Smith's God is impassible, cannot be affected or made to suffer by creation. That would imply imperfection or change. God's perfection means he's utterly beyond suffering, even though he permits it in creation.
And finally, just looking at where they're coming from philosophically, it's a clear split. Modern innovation versus ancient tradition.
Absolutely. Whitehead built a completely new system, process philosophy, explicitly designed to integrate modern science, relativity, quantum theory, evolution into a coherent metaphysics for our time. Smith revives ancient and medieval metaphysics, perennial philosophy, scholasticism. He argues against the modern turn, saying we need to return to this older wisdom to find a more complete truth.
So even their fundamental response to that initial problem, the bifurcation of nature, is totally different. One tries to weave the two worlds together. The other says we need to ditch the modern world's foundation and rebuild on the old one.
Exactly. Whitehead seeks to integrate science and experience into a new, unified ontology where both are valid and illuminate each other within a dynamic cosmos. Smith seeks to replace the flawed philosophical foundations of the modern worldview. He argues we must return to traditional metaphysics to overcome the split, because the modern scientific framework itself, left to its own devices, can't account for mind, meaning, or God. He doesn't just try to make science fit, he challenges the very philosophical ground science stands on.
It really boils down to a fundamental choice, doesn't it? A core metaphysical commitment.
Hmm.
Is ultimate reality, at its heart, a dynamic relational process, always becoming, always experiencing? Or is it a timeless, immutable being, the static, perfect ground from which everything else flows? There doesn't seem to be much middle ground.
That really is the heart of it.
Yeah.
However, two complete, coherent, but profoundly incompatible worldviews. Choosing between them demands a deep decision about the fundamental nature of existence itself.
So we've walked down these two incredible, but yeah, ultimately irreconcilable paths trying to make sense of things in the modern world. On one side, we had Alfred North Whitehead's process god, relational, involved, evolving, feeling the world's joys and pains as a fellow sufferer, constantly luring creation toward new possibilities, a vision offering perhaps companionship and hope in an uncertain universe.
Mm-hmm. A God who journeys with us.
And on the other side, Wolfgang Smith's traditionalist god. Absolutely transcendent, unchanging, mysterious, being itself, pure actuality, impassible, the immutable source of all that is. A god who provides maybe an unshakable foundation, ultimate security, unchanging truth in a world that feels like it's always in flux. A god existing timelessly untouched by creation's chaos.
The rock versus the river, in a way.
Yeah. Both of these frameworks, though, in their own very different ways, offer these powerful, comprehensive lenses, ways to think about God, reality, meaning how the pieces might fit together after that bifurcation, even if the final picture looks completely different depending on which lens you choose.
What's really striking is how both thinkers wrestled so deeply with that same core problem the science experience split, yet arrived at such opposite, yet incredibly thought-through solutions. They really push us to think about reality in ways that go far beyond just the scientific facts.
So as you've been listening to these two profoundly different visions, what kind of universe, what kind of ultimate reality resonates more with you? Does that idea of a fellow sufferer, a God who feels the world's pain with us, offer more comfort, more understanding? Or does the concept of an immutable source, that unchanging, perfect ground, provide a deeper sense of security in this chaotic world? And maybe how might holding one view versus the other actually shape how you think about meaning or purpose or your own place in the grand scheme of things? It's definitely a lot to chew on.
The deepest questions always are.